Gonna give people like a couple more minutes to join, and then we can get started. Toby, you can unmute yourself, and I can introduce you. Rigoberto, this is our executive director, Toby Jenkins, my boss.
Thank you so much for being willing to do this. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay. Oh, let me add this person. If you're just joining us, if I could have you mute your sound and video, so the people, we're going to be recording this, and so the focus can be on myself and Mr. Gonzalez. Okay. So my name is Donovid Sekulits. I'm the Outreach and Library Services Manager at Oklahomans for Equality. Today, we are joined by Mr. Rigoberto González, the author of Butterfly Boy, his memoir. And we're having him here to talk about his book and in honor of Hispanic Latinx Heritage Month, which is from September 15th to October 15th. And I thought it would be a really great opportunity to have a conversation about diversity and diversity within the LGBTQ community with someone who himself has experienced it. And so, yes, I'll take it to you. Tell us about yourself, Mr. Gonzalez.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me here this evening. I am coming to you from Newark, New Jersey. I was a New Yorker for many, many years, I think 21. So my 22nd year, I finally left Manhattan and moved to Newark, New Jersey. The oldest store in the world, the rent got too high, right? Anyway, I published a number of books, 17, I think, memoir, nonfiction, poetry. Received a number of recognitions for that. But maybe what's more relevant to this conversation today and to what I'd like to share with you that's not on my official bio would be that I was born in California but raised in Michoacan in Mexico until the age of 10. And at the age of 10, my family moved back to the United States, California specifically. And I think that from that migration sort of opened up a number of opportunities for me as a gay man. And I say this because education was my way out of not only the situation we were with and the son and grandson of migrant farm workers, but also opportunities outside of the family, outside of the community, because I felt that within that space, you know, I wasn't welcomed, or I was not going to have I was going to have a difficult time fitting in. And this, you know, were impressions that I got, not because I was told directly that being gay was not welcome, but based on the observations that I made, you know, things that were said around me, insults that were hurled at other people. So as soon as I had the opportunity to leave, I left by way of an education, and then I never turned back. And I think I spent, and some of you, I think most of you have read the memoir Butterfly Boy, but you know, there's not only memoir. I'm now working on, I think, my 5th And I keep going to those formative years, my teenage years, as an important part of my understanding of the past. And every decade, I take a look back at my past and I see it very differently, or I see something more, or it expands for me in one way or another. And so I feel the urge, and also the obligation to write it down. So I'm actually working on my 5th memoir, centering on my grandmother, Abuela Maria, who's a figure in Butterfly Boy.
Thank you, Rigoberto. So what was it like growing up in 2 different places so young? I mean, like that, it's kind of like the story. I mean, you have living between 2 different worlds. Can you kind of talk about that?
Yeah, well, it's like the reality is that when I was in Mexico, I was too young to understand exactly, what my sexuality was teaching me, or what my sexuality was showing me. I was still too young. Those questions were not quite formed yet. So I didn't see the world through that lens, not until my adolescence, which is when I began to develop these crushes on boys, right? And I think at that time, like I said earlier, I knew that in this particular household and this particular community, such a thing was not welcome. I think it was not only the teachings of Catholicism, but also the sort of hyper-masculine culture that I was growing up in. Of the grandchildren that were growing up together, there was 11 of us. There was only 2 females, so it was very dominantly male presence. And I knew very, very early on that I was very different from my male cousins and from my brother. I knew that I did like to do the same things, and it could have just been could have just been a different interest. But how I knew that I was different was I had different desires, and that was I think I realized that I was more than just different. That it was also this something in the interior here that was urging me to develop affinities or crushes or develop attractions, to the same sex. And it was all hidden. It was all kept secret because I think I was terrified, like many. I was terrified of being further misunderstood. I was terrified that this difference was going to be given a name that reduced all of who I was into one word or into one sort of thing, right? So I tried very, very early to imagine myself in a space where that was no longer going to be the case, where I could be a fully realized adult. And the first place I found that was in books, because in books I discovered not only different sexualities, but just different ethnicities, different ways of being in the world, different ways to interact. The world expanded for me. So all of a sudden I was not locked into a room or locked into a house or even locked into a town. It's like when I discovered that there was a whole world out there with so many different experiences, with so many different timelines and histories and cultures and languages, then it didn't seem like everybody was looking at me, right? Rather, I saw it as an opportunity to step out of it and find another place for myself in another environment with other people, right? But until that moment came, which is going off to college, until that moment came, I had to be really careful about what I said or what I did. If there were accusations hurled, they were not necessarily malicious, but they were intended to insult me, to offend me, to make fun of me, right? So that's what I became, And I saw this also on TV and in film, that the gay character was the clown, the gay character was a predator, the gay character was the unwanted, and I didn't identify with any of these images. I was not a clown. I didn't think of myself as that. I did not think of myself as a predator, and I certainly did not think of myself as unwanted necessarily. I just knew I was different, Somehow in this space that developed a hostility towards somebody like me, I knew that I was still loved, that they had to love me because I was related to them, right? And I wasn't sure that necessarily was going to be the case outside of the family, which is why I rarely ventured out of it. But when the opportunity came to cut ties, I took it. And I think that at the age of 17, I gained a kind of confidence and a kind of a courage, that allowed me to say, okay, I'm going to go off to college and I'm likely not coming back, right? And then once in college, meeting other people, meeting other gay people, completely changed the way that I feared the world, even as I courageously stepped into it. And also, I knew that there was going to be a place where I could be heard and seen, because I was seeing these other people. I was hearing these other people, and they were not the stereotypes that I had grown up understanding that gay people were. So that opened up a whole new world for me, a whole new, a bridge that was important for me to cross over, important for me to claim, and also sort of look back and sort of understand, well, what did it take for me to get here, and why was it so bad in the past?
Well, like that was great. It's interesting because one of my next questions was going to be like, what did like education and school mean to you growing up? I mean, I'll speak for like just a second on myself and say that like my kind of self-discovery came through reading and literature as well, and being able to kind of take myself out of my reality, which much like yours was not always great. Like what did you talked about like you were treated differently because you like were more intelligent and you cared more. So like, can you kind of talk about that and how that kind of maybe like helped you cope with the things you were dealing with like as a kid?
Yeah, I think that being different, especially in a household where there's so much chaos, there's 19 of us living in one space at one time. And I think that being different was also a way to create a kind of space for myself within this household. There was all chaos and all battles and conflicts. Also, there were some good memories. I don't want to just say it was all negative, but for me, being different kind of gave me the permission then to also create a different space for myself, meaning that, if everybody was going to go out and play, that it was okay because I was different. That was my excuse, my explanation for why I wasn't going to do that and why I was going to do something else. And I think that reading was that for me. Reading was the room of my own. I never had my own bed until I was a freshman in college. The first time I had my own bed. And before that, it was either the floor or sharing a bed with one or two other people because there just weren't enough beds to go around. So in the meantime, how could I not deliberately set myself apart, but rather create a space for myself that would allow me to think the things I wanted to think, to imagine the things that I wanted to imagine, that I didn't have to share with anybody, right? Because when I was reading a book, I was left alone. Somehow everybody understood, that was a very private thing, even though I could be doing it in front of everybody, be reading a book. But people understood that it wasn't like the television. The television was a very communal thing because there was a number of people around it. They would respond and react to the screen at the same time. But a book was a personal relationship, right? And I think that, I was one less person competing for attention. I was one less person taking up space in the living room, trying to control the TV. So people kind of left me alone. And I embraced that, right? I embraced that as an opportunity to just be myself in my own terms in a kind of closed doors, even though I was right there in front of everybody. And I think that sensibility allowed, people like my mother to also embrace me and to open up about certain things that she would not share with my brother or she would not share with other people. So I became kind of like her confidant in that way because she knew I was different. And I like to believe that she always knew that I was gay, even though she died when I was 12 years old. But somehow I like to believe she knew the whole time. But the moment to reckon with that never came because of her death. But before that, I was her confidant in that household. Not my father, not any of my aunts, not anybody else. It was me who she confided things in. And I think it was because she recognized something in me, a sensibility that she didn't see in anybody else. a kind of understanding of people in the world, and I think I built that up as a reader, which is, I mean, that's why we read. We read because we begin to learn what other people who are not like us think and feel and say. So we develop empathy, right? And I think that I developed that very early on. It wasn't deliberate, but certainly it was identified by my mother, and it certainly helped me sort of move through the world after that.
So you talk about your family, you're talking about like these experiences with your mother and your siblings, and how like, you kind of were like on your own, off doing kind of in your own space.
Mm-hmm.
In your book, you talk a lot about the trauma that you experience. And then like Latino culture, it's very grounded in like the family and like the closeness of family.
Right.
What, I guess, how did you, reconcile like, what you understood, like, okay, like this is my family, like I have to respect them and, honor them, versus like the kind of the things that you were going through, like I can't imagine, having to like writing about that as an adult, what that like kind of meant, because I know that for me, family is important, and it was kind of hard sometimes when the people that you call family and they're all that you have, and then they treat you differently, or you experience things that are less than good.
Yeah, well, the complexity of the family is this, they are the people that teach us love. They are the people that teach us affection, that teach us understanding and compassion. But they're also the people that can teach us damage. They can teach us hatred, dislike, derision. That's how family is. You can't choose one or the other. You have to accept them all, right? Otherwise, and then you don't have a relationship, or you don't learn anything from your family. So I knew that despite the fact that I loved my family, that I had to tolerate them to a certain point, and that I had to try to understand why they would do the things they did. Why is it that in this particular household, why were gay people sort of seen as weaklings? Why were gay people sort of put fun at? And so I took a step back later. I mean, it was in the moment, I had no choice but to accept in many ways, because where could I go unless I ran away, right? But later I began to really understand that there was other kinds of hurt going on in the family. Now that doesn't excuse it, right? That doesn't excuse it, but it offers at least a little bit of insight into why things were said, why things were done. There was a lot of other kinds of violences in the family. There was domestic abuse. That certainly was there. And, I think back and I realized, well, what else could have happened when you throw in 19 people into one space? These conflicts are going to happen, right? And so I think, if anything, the books, the writing of the books have been a way for me to try to, if not forgive my family, to at least try to understand them. So the reckoning, the reconciling didn't really happen while I was there. I think while I was there, I just had to put up with it. I felt like I had no choice. But it's been happening ever since. Like even now, I just turned 50 and I'm still writing about these things. I'm still trying to understand, which is why I'm writing this book now with my grandmother at its center. And I'm trying to understand why my grandmother was, one of the most wonderful human beings I knew, why was she married to one of the most horrible human beings I knew, my grandfather? And so I'm trying to unwrap that finally, this many years later. So that's a long process, right? It's a long process. But I think it's important to understand, that family, that you're going to love your family, that your first, the first people that cause you harm, the first people that cause you damage are most likely going to be your family members, right? That's just the harsh reality of it. And I remember, when Butterfly was first published in 2006, and I remember going, on tour with the book, and I was in a classroom one time, in a classroom, and a young man, very after my talk, a very earnest young man came up to me and said, there's one thing I just don't understand. If you had such a difficult time with your family, why did you just pick up and leave, right? Why did you stay? And then I thought to myself, and then at the moment I thought, well, I mean, isn't this the case for many people in domestic abuse situations? And why don't they leave? Because it's so easy to say, oh, if they treat you badly, but just leave. If they did. But the reality is this is so complex, you know, and the reality is that for many of us, we actually love these people as well. We love them, even though they cause us harm. And that doesn't mean that we are weak. That doesn't mean that they have complete power over us. It just means that there's this bond that's really unbreakable. I think for many people, they come to the realization that they can no longer continue that, and that's what does it. Or who knows what finally manages to allow a person to kind of, you know, step away from the relationship. But in the meantime, you know, you're so close to those individuals. You're like, well, these people are part of my life. If I break away from them, what is my life going to look like, and am I going to be able to survive it, right? And you have to remember that as a young Mexican immigrant kid in a family of farm workers that were in poverty, you know, what would be my reality? Just picked up and ran away. I don't think I would have survived very long.
It's I when I read your book, I feel like I was like reading about like a story about myself.
Mm-hmm.
Like I too am like the son of an immigrant. My mother immigrated to this country in 1987 as a teenager to Newark, New Jersey, or not Newark, but Union City, New Jersey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A very vibrant Dominican population there.
Right.
And so I identify as Afro-Latino. And my experience with growing up, you know, with my mother, very similar to like the culture that you grew up in, the very machismo, like
Mm-hmm.
man is like a man acts like this, you know. I grew up with just a single parent, but like my mother was not a practicing Catholic, but she had like those beliefs instilled in her at a young age. My mother is about your age, and she like tells me, well, this is just like what I knew, this is what I understood. And so, you know, I too had my own, you know, feelings of like, why are they like this when this person's like this, you know, person that I'm supposed to care about, and kind of, you know, realizing, you know, hearing you talk, it's like, you know, it's never really their fault. It's just like they're the, you know, their conscious self is like, you know, derives from like the culture they grew up in, and so it's just kind of a systemic thing, and it's kind of up to us, like the kids of these parents, to like kind of change that conversation. So I really respect your openness to like share that, because a lot of queer youth, you know, stay in really harmful situations, not because they want to, but it's like, this is their family. What do they do without their family? Especially if you're like a gay poor kid, you know, like that's not really an option. So like you were saying, you know, why do people stay in situations that are harmful? It's like, maybe they have no other choice.
Exactly.
If you could kind of explain for people who don't know, like what machismo culture is, and then like how it affected you, like growing up, you know, as a gay Mexican.
Yeah. Well, you know, the interesting about machismo is that this actually exists in every culture, right? For some reason, I don't know why it got sort of the term in Spanish stuck, and why it's sort of seen as only a Latin American sort of condition, because it actually exists in every culture that I've come across, where there's a very masculinity, right? Toxic masculinity and the male dominance, right? So for some reason, you know, that's why I always kind of, I'm always troubled by the word, because machismo is like as if, oh, it existed there first and everybody else caught on. It's like, it's always been everywhere, but somewhere it's stuck with the Latin American. I guess because there's a stereotype, right, of the sort of the hyper masculine, you know, Latin lover, you know, we have so many stereotypes: the Latin lover, the drunk, you know, the stern sort of presence. I think so much of that also comes from, you know, the colonizer culture that we had. I mean, it's a patriarchy of Catholicism, the patriarchy of Europe. I mean, that's where I always tell my students, look, we know we were colonized because we were left with three things. We were left with religion, language, and our names. Those are the three things that the Spaniards left, that's the legacy that we inherited. But anyway, so this particular condition is where, this patriarchy is enforced on so many levels. It's not only in the male dominance over a household, but even in the other relationships with the woman, with the children. It's expected, right, that the male is the voice, the authority, unquestioned, unchecked. That there is no confronting, right? That the word of the male head of the household is a final word, the last word. And so, even though people may sometimes not believe in that, it's so easy to slip into it because of the dynamics of the nuclear family. And this is instilled. It's all over TV. It's all over the media, where we see this model, right? Oh, there's a father, there's a mother, there's the children, and the father has a certain kinds of responsibility. So therefore, he is owed a level of respect, and he is also owed a level of power, right? Because of what he does, what he provides for the household. And I think that that can also translate into very negative things, that, the father or the male presence, arise, and he has to assert that power somehow. He has to remind people that he is the head of the household, whether that is through verbal communication or through physical, demonstration. So that's what machismo is really all about. I think that, even in families that somehow challenge those dynamics, it still exists. And I'll give you examples of that. With my grandparents, my grandmother was the one that worked. She's the one that went out to work in the fields, and my grandfather stayed home and cooked. So even though those roles were reversed, he was still sort of the male dominant presence in that household, right? And with my father and my mother, it was very clear to my brother and I that it was my mother who had the authority. It was my mother who called the shots, because my father just kind of surrendered and said yes, to everything. And she was the one that dealt with the money. She was the one that she had a bigger responsibility. And yet somehow we started to turn to him as an authority figure, right? Before my mother. So that, that's how even in places that seem to subvert or want to challenge the gender dynamics, machismo, right, or that particular understanding of relationships still exists. Right? It's because it's our default mode in many ways. We don't know what else, how else to understand the presence of a male figure in the family other than that. So not until we see other models of relationships, of understanding of what the male figure is in the household, not until we see more of that, not until we write about these issues, will we be able to change them.
Did it ever directly affect you? That was the second part of my question, like with your father or the male figures in your life.
Yeah, I think it directly in this way, that I was expected to demonstrate also a certain level of masculinity. I remember my grandfather sort of teasing me, like, why don't you have I was like, what, like young, I was like 13 years old. He's like, why don't you have a girlfriend? Why aren't you out chasing girls like the way your brother, or like, why aren't you doing that? Or even with my father, things that he felt were too girly, for me to do. He didn't, thankfully he didn't think that reading or a typewriter were girly. But I know that the one thing that I did that I was terrified to tell my family was when I entered the choir, the choir in school, because I like to sing. I wanted to sing. And I thought, oh my God, if my father finds out, he's going to kill me, because this is such a girl thing to do, is to be in a choir and stand up and sing Christmas songs, to everyone. And then I'm not sure if I can't remember now what I wrote in the book, but I don't know if I mentioned in the book that that I used to be a singer, that I had a very sort of distinct voice when I was very young. And my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, had suggested that I audition for the Niños Cantores de Morelia. Niños Cantores de Morelia were like the Vienna Boys Choir. They were the only sort of all-boys conservatory in the Americas. that was comparable to the Vienna Boys Choir, and it was in Morelia, which was right down the street from where my little hometown of Zacapu was. And my grandmother had said to my father, why don't you let him audition? Because once he became one of those niños cantores, then you were financially secure, right? And my father apparently said, are you kidding me? And then he's gonna grow up to be a faggot, right? So he like stunted that, and lo and behold, it wasn't that kept me from being gay, right? Or it kept me from understanding that I was gay. But that was my father's, response to that. I was like, are you kidding me? It's like, he's gonna become a faggot, if he's out there singing, That's why later when I joined the choir, like that stuck with me. And I must have been like 6 years old when I remember hearing that conversation. So when I'm like 11 or 12, and joining the choir, and I realized, oh, my father better not know about this, at all, because, he'll probably beat me or something, because I'm doing this. So in those ways, right, it's really more policing my behavior, policing what I did that would bother them, for what, I have no idea, I have no idea. I remember I had a little cousin who also, and he was even more flamboyant than I was. I mean, I was effeminate in some ways, but I also learned to check myself because I received so many abuses, so many reprimands, right? So much teasing and taunting that came with it. So I learned to really police myself early on. But I had a younger cousin who was even more sort of outlandish with behavior. He would do things like get like a dish towel and put on his head like a wig, And I remember sometimes, people would just look at him and be like, oh, that little boy is kind of silly or crazy. But every once in a while, his father, my uncle, would just be in a wrong mood, just in the wrong, in the wrong mind frame. And it would just get up and just beat him right in front of all of us. Even though he'd been doing this, all day or whatever, nobody thought, we just kind of excused it as a kind of childish eccentricity. But if my uncle caught him at the wrong time, he would just get up and beat the child. And I remember that my cousin just being confused about what he was doing. What did he do that deserved this punishment? Because he wasn't doing anything different than he was doing 5 minutes, an hour ago, right? So that kind of messaging, right? That kind of messaging is what directly impacts, an individual or somebody like me who is trying to, I just wanted to move in this world as quietly as possible. And here I am sort of being policed in ways that my other cousins, my male cousins, were not being policed for doing things like fighting. They fought in school, or if they cut school, or if they got in trouble, it's like, oh, boys, those are boys. And I never did any of these things. I never got in trouble. I never got in a fight. And I never got a medal for it. I never got a recognition for that, ever. It was like, if anything, I was being punished for doing these other things, which I was like, okay, so, sitting here doing this harmless thing is a big affront, but, my cousin's getting expelled from school. It's like, well, those boys.
Oh, well, one last question before I kind of switch the conversation to more current event kind of question. What was your experience coming out like? I know like the whole idea of like coming out game, tell people, and there's like today it's a very like big deal, and I know maybe like 25 years ago it's like a very quiet thing versus like a very public thing now. That we like social media, you write an op-ed or something. And I know you went away to school, away from your life, to be free of that, to be independent and to kind of make your own way. Like when was that transition for you? Like, was it very like, oh, hey, my family, like I'm gay, or was it more just like you and your life kind of accepting yourself and then it just kind of happened like naturally?
Yeah, well, the reality is, I think that because social media didn't exist, this idea of being outed, had a very different sort of context. I'm growing up in the 80s, right? So a very different, being outed had a very different context. I also was growing up during the AIDS era, so being outed as gay, immediately you were sort of cast as like a danger or a threat. So that's really the context of coming out, especially in California in the I graduated high school in 1988, for crying out loud. It's like at that point, the ignorance around HIV was just rampant. People didn't know. Immediately, it was a death sentence, but it was also a threat. There were all these laws were trying to be passed to quarantine gay men, whether or not they were HIV or not. And, at the time, but both, twice the administration, LaRouche, right? LaRouche tried to do that, and twice that failed because people were like, really? Are we really going to round up all the gays, and quarantine them? So that, but that for a minute was a reality, right? So all of a sudden, why would you want to come out? Why would you want to come out during the period where immediately you would be associated with disease, sickness, death, and threat? There was absolutely zero incentive to come out. None. Where now, where there's a very supportive environment, not that it's easy for everybody, because I think it's still hard for some people to come out, but it's a very different context, right? Coming out I think the first time I saw these things, I just wept because I had no idea that the day would come where you could come out and people would throw parties for you and congratulate you and offer support, or that you come out to your parents. I would hear this from my students. I would hear that from younger people when they finally would tell me, oh, when I came out, this happened, or yeah, I came out to my parents, and they were just kind of, okay, no big deal. And I just could not imagine my own sort of situation being anything close to that. So for me, coming out was very much the stages. In school, I actually, in college, I came across other gay men who were out, professors who were out. And, they knew I was gay, the gaydar. They knew I was gay, but they also knew that I wasn't ready to say anything. So I didn't officially come out and in any sort of public way. I don't think ever. I was out to certain friends of mine, my close friends. I have not come out to any member of my family except for my brother. And that was important for him to know, and even then he said, well, I kind of already knew, but I was waiting for you to tell me. I came out to his wife, of course, and his children, or at least his daughter, knows that I'm gay. And it was important for them to know that about me, because I said, the rest of the family doesn't know, and I don't care that they know or don't anymore. I cut off that family completely. I'm my own person somewhere else. But if you're going to be part of my life, you have to know it's about me, and that's the terms. So now when I have, when I have like a cousin or a relative that wants to have some kind of relationship with me, then I say, okay, but you have to understand that this is who I am. If that's going to be a cause of shame for you, if that's going to be a cause of consternation, then you know what? See you later. It was good to see you again, meet you. But other than that, this is who I am. I've worked hard to get to a point where I'm comfortable talking about it, where I can identify, in sort of literary spaces, where I talk about being gay, those things are important, right? And I think the person that taught me that, to be very honest when you are in front of a crowd of people, the person that taught me that, even though she never knew, was this woman when I was like a freshman or a sophomore in college. And I remember that I was in this program where we had to attend certain symposiums or talks and then report back. And so I attended this one of this woman who was an activist and an artist, and she was talking about something. And I remember she was there in front of everybody, and all of a sudden she said, well, as a lesbian, I froze. I thought that she was going to be attacked. I thought that somebody was going to start throwing a chair, that she was going to get booed, that people were going to hurt her. I just went like cold, thinking, oh my God, I'm going to watch somebody get murdered right in front of me, right? To my shock, nothing happened. Everybody just sat there listening to the rest of the talk. And I'm like, what? It's like, I had no idea that you could actually say that and live. Who knew? It was the first time I ever saw it in my life. The first time I ever saw it in my life. And I thought, when the time comes, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to do the same thing because I never know who's in the audience, who's going to need to hear that. That woman never knew. I didn't go up to her and tell her, oh my God, I never went, and I never tracked her down ever after all that and told her. See, so she doesn't know that she did this amazing thing for me, right? So I think that that's what I do when I'm in public, and somehow I manage, to talk about, just say that, right? And it's happened to me, you know, at least once. I remember when I was in Decatur, Georgia, at a talk, and I was promoting the young adult novel, the Mariposa Club, and this young man, you know, young white man, probably had to be a teenager, had to be high schooler, very, very young. You know, people come in and get their books signed. He just walked up to me and he kind of leaned in and whispered and said, "Do you know of any other books about people like us?" Right? But be quiet, like I was whispering, right? And I said, yes, of course. And then I wrote them down, you know, a piece of paper, and I handed it to him. He says, you know, start there and keep looking, right? And so that was a one moment in which, you know, this being out, being public was important. But again, you never know. I might have inspired, I might have helped people who never came up to me and thanked me, right? And I tell my own writing students the same thing. It says, you don't know who you're going to help. Because most of the time, they're not going to come up to you. They're not going to say thank you. They're not going to be visible to you. But you have changed their lives. And how do I know this? Because all of your lives were changed by other people. And did you thank all those people? Did you go up to those people and thank every single one of those people that you? No, you didn't. You did not. Right? But they changed your lives. So therefore, it is then you just do what you have to do. Right? Be who you are, because somehow you're going to inspire a young woman, a young man. You can inspire a trans individual. You can inspire whatever, you know, whoever's out there that needs to hear it. Right? Somebody has gone through some experience. Somebody has gone through the same journey or something similar or something, or that they identify somehow. You know, the first 2 years of Butterfly Boy being in print, every week without fail, I would receive an email from somebody saying, "That's my story, that's my cousin, that's my uncle, that's my friend, that's my nephew, that's my son," right? For 2 years, every week, you know, and I knew that, you know, two things happened for me that moment. One is that I was glad that other people didn't feel alone in the world, and two, that I wasn't alone in the world, because I didn't know that many people like me. I didn't know that many people with my story, which is why I wrote it, because I wanted to find them, and I did.
You know, it's interesting that you say that, because, you know, you talked about at the beginning of the conversation, you talked about how your experience in seeing like people, you know, who you kind of identified with, even though you didn't have a name for it, you know, were kind of made fun of or, you know, stereotyped. And now you yourself are, you know, a person of significance to queer people, to queer Latinx people.
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of like, does that feel like inspiring, the fact that, like, you know, you were a kid who needed that, who didn't have that, and now you are that person that you needed, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I always talk about that. You know, I always talk about the bookshelf. That's why I say, "Oh, my bookshelf." And my bookshelf when I was very young, you know, I didn't see my specific identity, though I did reach to some very important books. And some of the important books, you know, I try in my memoir, I think I do mention Truman Capote, right? It's like, who knew that this, you know, older white man would be a source for me, right? To at least understand something of myself. Or even, you know, the novel Maurice by Ian Forster, because somebody I heard that, I read somewhere that this book dealt with homosexuality, and I read this book. It was by this Irish author, and there I am, you know, oh my God, the story about, it's a love story between two men. And then when I went to college, you know, then I looked for the books. It was easier because I couldn't find those books in my library. You know, this is the thing with books and libraries and in schools, that they're very controlled. I hope it's changed, but I'm going back to 1988, right? At the time, you know, you couldn't really get a book without your parents' permission. Crying out loud, how does that work? If you don't want your parents to know what kind of books you're going to take out, but certain books you could not take out unless you have your parents' permission. I mean, talk about really, and this is before the internet, by the way, too, right? I couldn't just plug in like I can now, which is why I think the internet is also wonderful. I mean, people complain about it all the time, and so do I. I complain about social media and oversharing, but at the same time, you know, the fact that now you can be on your phone, you know, be like, okay, I have these questions. Let me Google this, right? And that is a possibility where I remember when I was young, I saw something in the back of a magazine. I had to send for a pamphlet. I had to send for a pamphlet in the mail. And I waited for the damn pamphlet for weeks before it got there, right? That's how slow things came to me, right? And so then the idea of actually being in a position to find a book that dealt with somebody with my experience, with my ethnicity, my sort of class, my immigrant status, those books just were not there. When I was in college, there were three or four prominent gay Latinx writers. There was Francisco Alarcón, who was a poet. There was Michael Nava, who was a mystery novelist. John Recchi, right, who was also a legend. And Gil Cuadros. Gil Cuadros was a San Francisco writer who published this sort of well-known book. I forget that. Something, I think, A City of God or something like that. Anyway, so these were the only books that were available for me to access, but they were important to me. You know, they were important to me, even though it was a mystery book, even though there was a book set in El Paso in 1960s with a hustler, something I could not identify with. But I'm like, you know what? But somehow these outsiders I can identify with, right? And yes, you know, I found the outsider in me in other kinds of books, not necessarily about homosexuality. But when you find those, right? When you find those that are such a perfect mirror for you, is a very different kind of experience. It's really, you know, finding your kind, right? As much as I owe somewhat a huge debt to all these other books that introduced me to the world, right? That brought me into the world. I have to say that I have a special place in my heart for those very specific books that said to me, oh my God, and here's somebody who's, you know, whose parents were Mexican, you know, somebody like even Richard Rodriguez, who's kind of a troubled figure back in the day. He wrote about, you know, eventually about being gay. And I was like, okay, well, these are the books that I wanted. And so I set out, my goal was just to write as many books as I could, because I wanted that bookshelf, right? That bookshelf to keep expanding. And, you know, since then, you know, the other wonderful writers, you know, Manuel Munoz, Alex Espinosa, and all these other young, wonderful writers, you know, trans writers who are really using who are exercising this voice, who are making visible these experiences that they're even much more different than mine because of the different times we live in. There's different conflicts now with social media, right? There's different challenges in the moment. As much as there's been so much progress, right? We're still getting killed, that's the reality, right? But at the same time, not necessarily to the kind of degree of threat that we faced in previous generations, right? So it's been great. It's been gratifying to see that. It's been great to see young men and young women, right? Because now there's also the spectrum is there of writers, right? That they can, young people that can access these books and feel inspired to write their own stories, right? Because it's important. It's important for these stories to continue to be spoken, because there's always the next generation of people, of young people who are struggling to understand, you know, how to move in this world. And my work has limitations, because my work takes place in the 70s. These young people don't want to know what it's like to be, they don't want to know what it's like to move in the world in the 70s. They can learn something from it, right? But they also want to learn what more contemporary space. How do you move in the world in the present, right? You learn from the past, but you also have to learn from the present as well. So that's why they're necessary still, these stories.
You know, this is a good like segue to like my next question. So like, you know, we are one of the lucky few, I guess, who like, you know, we have the intersection of identities, you know. So for some people, you know, they you know, we have, you know, we face as gay men, you know, homophobia, but we also face xenophobia too, and racism. And I'm curious, you know, how you yourself, you know, kind of deal with both of them, you know, 'cause it's like simultaneous. You're like, oh, you know, I could get, you know, discriminated or harassed because of the language that I speak, but I could also get punched, you know, because, you know, or attacked because, you know, of who I love, you know. Right. How do you kind of deal with those?
I think the most important thing to learn about that is that you don't have to choose. You don't have to decide. Once you understand that you move in the world with these simultaneous identities, you don't have to be a, well, you know what, I'm going to fight racism today. I'm going to fight homophobia the other day. It doesn't work like that. And the reality is, when people see you, they'll see you. They'll see me as a brown person, but the next split second, they might see me as a gay person. So it's not that far. The kind of realization of who I am is not. It's not 5 minutes or 5 hours apart. It's like seconds apart, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is that our communities, I have different communities. My queer community, yes, has to deal with racism, and I think that intersexual identities have really led that conversation, because it was intersectional people that refused to decide. Say, oh, you know what, I'm Black, so I'm gay, I'm Black, but I can't deal with the racism and queerness. Or, you know, I'm gay and I'm Black, but I can't deal with homophobia in my community. Those terms are already have been troubled in a good way, right? Because there's so many people that overlap, right? And then you look at people that have even more embraced more identities, right? So for me, you know, I would say, well, the immigrant community, the queer community, the Latinx community, you know, are important to me. Also, as a person with a disability, the disabled community is important to me. So I can be all of these things. I can move to the world with all of these, embracing all of these, celebrating them. And the thing is, I'm not going to let things overpower one of my identities over another, so that I feel like, oh my God, I just got discriminated against for being gay or for being brown, and then translate that into a kind of hatred. Right? If I say, well, if somebody made a racial slur, I can't then immediately sort of cast a light of hatred towards people who are racist. It's like it can't be. You just can't react like that. You have to understand that, you know what, there's going to be all these group of people that accept me and that love me and that are not going to hurt me. That's just one person. So I can't let that one person or that one incident I define how I respond to the world or how I respond to these affronts. I can't let that happen, right? And so that's a danger, right? That's a danger when, as you're trying to understand or trying to navigate racism and homophobia, is when you let it, you know, become something bigger than it really is. Because those incidents are not the fights that we're actually taking on. Somebody calling you a name is really not the fight that we're all in for. We're in for like we're in for the long game. We're in for like changing the culture, not just changing one person, not changing that one person's mind. That's a waste of energy. That person's not going to change their mind, and it's not going to make a difference if that person changes their mind. It's not. But to change a culture, to change a nature, right? To change our way of being, of understanding, that's what we really want to do.
Thank you. I'm gonna open it up to questions now. I think Toby will like to ask a question. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, Toby, for the audience.
Sorry, I can't see this on my phone without glasses. So thank you so much. This has been really enjoyable. I just was curious, what about when you wrote the book Crossing Vines?
Mm-hmm.
What motivated you to get that story out there? Because it was very well received.
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, that book was kind of a love letter to my family. I mean, the research came first as one of the novels, because I was joining my family as a farm worker. So I always knew that I wanted to commemorate and pay tribute to that life through a book. And but I also wanted to break open that identity of a farm worker, because I think farm workers in the political arena has sort of been seen like a monolith. It's like, oh, the farm workers, we have to fight for the farm workers because of the unhealthy conditions, because of this or that. And I appreciate that. I appreciate those movements. I appreciate that. But having been a farm worker, I also know that there's so many identities, so many lives, and so many stories within that, that group, that I wanted to write as many as I could, in that particular novel. That's why there's so many characters in there. I want to say, so that if you had, what is the definition of farm worker? You'd have like the novel Crossing Vines, because it's all of these and more, right?
Hello?
Yes. Would you mind introducing yourself for us and then asking your question?
Yes, my name is Marcia Bruno Todd. I'm so happy to hear from you. Hi. My question is actually a little bit selfish. I'm raising my most big act to fix the culture is being a mother, right? I have 3 babies and I want your advice. How do I what words of wisdom to empower them to be okay and happy for who they are?
Well, it sounds like you're already halfway there if you're aware of it. I think that awareness is really what makes a big difference. Having seen many of my friends who are mothers, who became mothers, and who wanted to change that, because their brothers or their friends were gay, and they wanted to, I'm so touched when my friends basically tell their children that I'm gay, right? That's part of their education of understanding this other human being. And it surprises. I didn't think that, that children would understand that young, or that would be curious about such things. But by being open, I think that the parents have allowed this identity not to be something foreign, not to be something scary, not to be something shameful, right? Because that was my experience in my family, because it was never said, it was never spoken, and it was only provided in a very negative context. Then I felt that it wasn't welcome, right? But then when there are illustrations or demonstrations of love for somebody who's different, that changes everything. I mean, it's almost and I have many godchildren, because many of my friends asked me to be the godparent of their child. And one of my godsons is now I think he's 10 years old, and of course I've known him since he was born. And I remember one time my friend called me and said, "Oh, I had the most interesting exchange with my son." I said, "Oh, really?" He says, "Yeah, he came home and he said, Dad, I think I like girls." And then so my friend said, "Oh, really? Well, that's good. You can like whoever you want. You can like girls if that's what you like. You can like boys. You can like both. You can like whoever you like, right?" And then the little boy said, "Yeah, but well, Nino Rigo, will he be upset? That he likes girls?" I think, well, no, see that, and then the conversation opened up, about that we were accepting of everybody, no matter who they like, right? But this kind of like a little reversal. And I'm also, inspired by other friends of mine who also teach their children. And one of the ways that they teach their children when they're very small is actually using one of my books. One of my books is called Antonia's Card, and it's a book about a little boy with 2 mothers, right? And that particular book, I think I give it to my friends all the time, and they're like, "Oh, I can't wait to read this book to my child," right? It's really that. It's really just the openness. It's really understanding, and it's also just accepting. The children, no matter are going to be whoever they are, and unconditional love is a very powerful thing. I want to believe that all mothers are capable of it, but I think that sometimes things that make it difficult for that to happen, right? So the only recourse then is to try to be the mother for whom it is possible to have unconditional love.
Thank you, Marcia. Does anyone else have a question? Well, I will ask you a question. Like, something to help wrap us up. What like advice would you give to like, people like myself and like my age group who are kind of the next, torchbearers of, continuing on, our culture and celebrating it, and also as being like, LGBTQ plus. We are kind of having a social reckoning at this moment of, being inclusive of everyone's identities, whether they be one or multiple, and something I'm really curious to hear from you about is this, transition we've made to be inclusive within the, our language and our culture of like, changing when talking about our community within the context of LGBTQ plus, referring to it as Latinx, to be inclusive of non-binary people. And like, there are a lot of people, there's mixed views I see who are very, they're not opposed to the inclusivity of like the word Latinx, but they also don't understand like why the word has to change, because to them and on their understanding of the language it is inclusive, but you have the people who are championing for it to be like a standard thing when we talk about like the community. So I'm curious as to like what your advice is for the people who are fighting for the change that needs to happen in both of our communities.
The reality is that change is going to happen. It's going to happen. And why do I know that? Because I'm 50 years old. I've seen it change the whole time. So it's not like, things, if they're stunted or ever frozen, things are going to change. The other thing I've learned is that as with each generation determines the terms. Not only the terms of naming, but the terms of relationships. When I, when I started seeing this change, even in my students for the non-binary, the use of they, right? They didn't want he or she, they, right? And so one of the things that friends of mine who were also professors, remember, they contacted me and said, well, what do we do about that? I mean, are we really going to try to keep track of all these pronouns? And I said to them, remember when we were young, and we used to make fun of some of the old professors that were very opposed to change and didn't like it. He says, yeah, well, you become that person. It's like, dude, you gotta change. You gotta change with the times, right? And so that's why I don't give a lot of credence. I think it's a lost energy. It's lost energy to have discussion about terms, because that conversation has been happening oh my gosh. It's happened every time that we added another letter to LGB. Right? LGBT, LGBTQI, LGBTQI, and people are like, well, how many do we need? I mean, like, well, we need as many as we need, right? And also people still kind of challenge queer. I know there's an older generation that doesn't like the word queer because it had a very different meaning during that certain times, and I completely understand that. I don't think that everybody should be changing everybody. People should just embrace what they embrace. You name yourself. That's the thing. That is the agency that we're all looking for. We name ourselves. We don't agree. We don't sit around and have a meeting and agree what to call this group or that group or that group. No, we have to name ourselves. We empower ourselves in that way, right? And so this happened with all the terms in the Latinx community. We have like, Chicano, and Chicano used to be a pejorative term at one term. So some people didn't like it in the 70s, but the 70s, they named it Chicano. And then later it became Latino, right? And then we were fighting against Hispanic, and now it's Latinx, and then even now it's like, what happened to Latina/O, or what happened, why X? Does X really matter outside the academy? And I'm like, if the conversation is happening in this room with these people, then that's the word. If this conversation is being taken to other places, then it becomes a situational thing where you have to understand, not impose, right? Because that, if you impose a term, if you impose anything, a value, that is against everything that we're fighting for. If we're fighting for inclusivity, if we're fighting for acceptance, if we're fighting for expanding, of definitions, of identities, expanding of ways of being, then to dictate, right, to narrow things down it's the antithesis of that. It actually works against it. So we have to be very careful how we have those conversations. We have to have those conversations. I think it's important. Conflict is part of that, absolutely. But when you get into somebody imposing or somebody demanding or somebody sort of establishing a kind of border, a boundary, or a barrier, then I think the conversation is not happening. Then it's an imposition, right? And so I think that once you understand, that change is inevitable, anything that works against it is really not worth the energy. That's it. And so I tell people all the time, you catch up or you step aside, step aside and be a cheerleader for once. You don't always have to be the front and center, and I'm looking forward to that moment as well, when I just kind of set aside and just kind of be a mentor from the side. I don't always have to be, I did many years of this, front and center, up on the stage. And I did so much of that. I'm not quitting. I'm just sort of shifting because there's new ways of being in the world that I don't quite understand, because I'm from a different generation. So my response shouldn't be distrust, shouldn't be cynicism, shouldn't be dislike. It should be, okay, let's turn that back on me. What is it that this is doing to me that I feel uncomfortable? Why do I feel uncomfortable? Not why they're making me uncomfortable. You change the ways of discussing this, and then you don't come across as a terrible person. Because I think that people that do not see the world, through those different terms, not what others do to you, right? Not what you do to others, but what is happening, the complexity of it. That needs to be embraced. That needs to be understood. If there is none of that, then there's no conversation,
Thank you. So I didn't even think to mention at the beginning, kind of where I'm from. Well, so we're talking from Tulsa, Oklahoma. I don't know what your understanding of our state and city is, but we live in a very conservative state that was, Indian country. It's Indian country, and so like it's a very melting pot of people, even in a very white dominated conservative state. And in Tulsa specifically, we have a multicultural groups here, and we have a pretty decent sized Latino community, most of it being Central American. And
Right.
like as I'm talking to you and I both identify as gay Latin X-men, and we know that there are other people like us, but as you saw, like maybe whether you were prepared to like get these names, the people reaching out to you after you wrote Butterfly Board or not, it's like people reached out to you. And so I'm curious, what like organizations like ours and community centers like ours that specifically work with the queer community and also with advocates, it's like we're an organization for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
How we can be I think that's the word I'm looking for, objective about like how we engage like the communities within our community.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I first visited the center, was like 4 years ago, and I met Toby, and I also met someone who was not yet a part of this conversation, but like he's the reason why like I'm working here. My friend Jose Vega, he was the deputy director of the Youth for Equality. He is a gay Mexican, and he's the reason why I'm here working and why I value this so much in this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Because if not for him, you and I would not be having this conversation right now. It's because of me feeling like welcome, and not by anything he did exactly, just him being himself in this space. And I take it very seriously, having this conversation with you, because I wanted to bring more people to interact with us, and I'm curious just like how you think organizations can like do that, or even if you're like interacting with people on a different level, because
Yeah.
there's this perception of organizations like ours that we're out of touch or we can't interact, that we're a white organization, but like that's not true. We interact with multiple cultural groups, and so I'm just, what are your thoughts?
I think that the key to that is visibility. It's just being visible, because if people that think or that that don't quite know what the center, what this organization is about, what are they, what is their source of knowledge? What are they seeing, what are they hearing, right? So visibility is really a way of changing that perception, right? So visible, and not only making more visible presence in the community, but events that bring in different kinds of people, right? And you invite, you get the word out somehow, right? That's probably the easiest way, right? The easiest way is just to demonstrate that, you know, that what you're doing, your programming, even your leadership, right? That will create a demystify the perception that this is just a mostly white space, right? Because I think that does happen a lot, you know, especially with LGBT communities. Said, oh, LGBT communities are mostly white. I said, but yeah, but they're also, you know, but when you really sit down and take an account of who your people are, you realize that you're not, that's actually false. And even in this group of white individuals, there's different identities within them as well, right? So one way is to really be visible about it and be very deliberate about the kind of programming that you have. You know, I think that you know, that matters. That matters. It's like, you know, what kind of signage is up to let people know. Because even if people don't necessarily come, the fact that they know you exist is important, right? Like I said, it's just like those people that I said that are in the audience. You never know whose life you're going to change because they know you exist, right? So what resources are available, for example, for those that may not be willing to step into a center physically? You know, is there a virtual space like this where they could do it through they have some sort of safety, right? Because I don't, in a conservative space, I don't want to, you know, speak for you, but I don't know how much people are comfortable, you know, going into an LGBT center. I know that, you know, during my time, certainly it really wasn't done, because if somebody saw you, the wrong person saw you go in, you know, or associate with somebody associated with that community, then immediately you were seen differently, right? You were suspect. So one way to reach out to that audience is really virtually, right? And so is your Facebook page, is that really active? Is that really demonstrating the values that you espouse, you know, of diversity and inclusion, right? Those are the things, you know, just the what do you call it? The optics of it are important too, right? So that you see, and then other people will begin to understand that this is actually a diverse community, right? And that people are welcome there, right? And it's not going to be easy, you know, it never is, right? There's always going to be challenges, and I think that your true value of who you are as an organization will be demonstrated in how you deal with those challenges, and how you deal with a complaint, and how you deal with a conflict. You know, that's when you really are going to demonstrate who you really are, not just in putting faces, you know, making faces visible. I think it's in those moments, you know, that are going to show who you really are, and that's when you're going to win people over. Right? So those conversations have to happen. You know, how do you talk about racism? How do you talk about intersectional identities? How do you talk about moving in these different, and how do you talk about how you move into the community space, or how do you bring the community space to you, right? Because one thing you want to do, you don't want to just descend on the community and be like, we're your saviors. That's the wrong way to do it, right? So, and in what way do you also make your space available? Because some spaces, you know, are never going to be seen as friendly spaces to enter. Though we, for certain working class people that don't enter museums, right? Or working class people that don't go into academic institutions because they feel that they don't belong, right? So then what then do those institutions do to build that bridge, right? So one way is really to try to understand the community, not just, you know, it's too easy to say we created so they're gonna come. That's too easy. And that's placing the onus on other people, right? So one thing is, the one word of advice I can offer you is to listen to the community. What is the community saying? And if you're not hearing it, you gotta listen even harder, That's the thing. You can't just say, well, nobody's coming or nobody. No, you got to do the work.
Well, I want to thank you, Rigoberto, for taking the time to talk to us. It really means a lot to me, and I know that this group of people that, you know, we can have someone like with your identity share your experience. I see a lot of my like self in your story. Like I said, you know, I was a kid, you know, with immigrant parents. You know, I too like enjoyed literature, and like literature helped me escape. And, you know, I myself am now a bit of a writer, and to see how successful you've been to come from where you came from is very inspiring to me, and like motivates me to like know that like you were talking about like how, you know, you, when you were first writing, how, you know, seeing, even though those few number of authors that were queer and Latinx, that, you know, there's twice as many now after.
Yes.
You know,
There's many more.
So I want to let you know that, you know, your work is not lost on people, and that like you have inspired me to like be like, you know, a writer, to continue like the visibility. So I want to thank you again, and if you can like just tell people where they can find more information about you, or if they want to like purchase your books.
Yeah, well, you can start with my website, rigobertogonzalez.com. You know, start there. That has all of my books, and then you can, you know, go from there. But thank you everybody for opening the space up for me. I felt very welcome, and I'm so glad to connect with the community. I don't think I would connect with in any other way. You know, I mean, when do I find my way myself in Oklahoma? I don't. But here we are. You know, by the magic of this platform. So, I mean, I think that's also an important learning lesson, right, for all of us. It's like, well, in the same way that you connect to somebody that's on another part of the country, you can also connect to somebody that's in the other part of town that does not feel quite comfortable yet meeting in person.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Do you have any final words, Toby? Well, thank you, and we thank you so much for taking the time to talk. It was really great to hear from you.
Great. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure, and everybody have a good night. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.